I have never been more immersed in any world than The Lord of the Rings.
For children are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. Which is just...
That is one of the hardest quotes I have ever read in a long time.
One of the most famous quotes from this article explains what children are capable of and also what fantasy, even in the modern sense, means. Would Tolkien define Fourth Wing as a fairy story? Welcome back to another Tutor Ramble episode. I am one of your hosts, Austin.
I'm your other host, Richard.
I am stoked for today's episode. If you see by the title, this is an article, an essay created by the one and only J.R.R. Tolkien. This was written back in 1947, but we'll get into some more information. It was actually a lecture that he was doing, but we'll get to that in a second. But this is an article, essay breakdown called On Fairy Stories. It is Tolkien essentially defending and defining what fairy stories are. And back then, the reason that he's talking about fairy stories is there wasn't the genre of fantasy at the time. Fantasy is discussed. There's a huge section about fantasy, and we will define so much of that in this episode and break down the article. And if you want to go read that, it'll be in the description below before you watch this, or we can inform you on it. You can read it afterwards, read along, however you want to go about it. But Rich, this article, 5 stars on the Rambler rating scale. There is so much nugget of truth. It still gets quoted to this day. I'm so glad that we read it for the episode because this is going to be a long episode to break down. I'm excited.
Oh yeah, I am too. I did a immersion reading on it as well. So I'll have it linked down below as well. Catholic Podcast basically did an audiobook version of this essay. You should check them out. Give them some love. I listened to that while I was also physically reading.
Yeah, we do episodes like this. We had an episode on the article titled On Science Fiction by C.S. Lewis. We love doing that. Turns out these fantasy authors, especially classic fantasy authors, write very, very convincing and thought-provoking articles on the subject. So if you all like this kind of content, let us know so we do more of the article breakdowns. But do you want to get started with this entire thing? On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah, sure. Let's get into the origin of it. Again, there's no spoilers because
it's an essay.
It's an essay. It's an essay/lecture, whatever it is. Point being, everyone can watch this one. And
point to that is this was, it came out in 1947 is when he wrote it, but it was based on a lecture he gave in 1939. Now, this lecture he gave was at the University of St. Andrews in the Andrew Lang Lecture Hall. And Andrew Lang was an author. He had a lot of fairy tale stories he wrote back in the 1800s and early 1900s, I believe, but even before Tolkien's time. And this was a high honor. And actually Tolkien, believe it or not, was the third choice in the line of lecturers where somebody was invited. They said, no, can't make it. I'm on a coffee break. And somebody else was invited to say, no, I got to walk my dog. And then Tolkien, he accepts the invite to the lecture. And this is coming at a time where Tolkien had already written The Hobbit, and it was already fairly popular enough where Tolkien was already a name. He was not the name we know of him today, but The Hobbit was written in, I want to make sure I have this right, but I believe, 1937, and he was giving this lecture a couple years later. And the Lord of the Rings series that we all know and love came out in 1954 and 55, so it's before that time. It's in that in-between period to give historical context. But when Tolkien was invited, he said this is how much of an honor it was for him, and we'll be quoting Tolkien a lot here. He said, I felt like a conjurer who finds himself, by mistake, called upon to give a display of magic before the court of an elf king. After producing his rabbit, such a clumsy performer may consider himself lucky if he is allowed to go home in proper shape, or indeed to go home at all. There are dungeons in fairyland for the overbold. And he was just saying how honored he was. He says even in fantastic words of thank you for the invite. He could have just said thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew's Hall. Andrew is dead, so not yes. Thank you, Andrew. But yes, did you find anything about the information, the background of it that stuck out to you?
I mean, in general, there's something nice about a lot of these. So C.S. Lewis and also Tolkien and plenty of other people. There's a ton of written versions of lectures being done, and now I'm discovering it was far more common back in the day.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it. So I'm glad he actually took the time to write this down.
Yes.
And I wonder how close it is to his actual lecture, because of course him giving the time to actually word it a little bit more clearer because he's a writer.
Exactly.
I would imagine he's a writer first, speaker second.
I like to think if we took our podcast ramblings and wrote an essay, it would be 1% more comprehensible.
I would hope so.
I would hope we would take out a lot of the jargon and make it something provocative. If you think about us breaking down something like this, because like you said, the lecture that he gave probably was a visage of just a form of, he probably rambled a bit, didn't have an exact thing, but this essay was a lot more. He put all of his thoughts down over the span of several years. So
also there's the aspect for this lecture in particular. He's invited to the Andrew Lang Hall.
Yes.
And he references Andrew Lang a few times in this story. More to the detriment of kind of calling out Andrew Lang and going, cut to the chase of it, the essay, a good chunk of it is about what is fairy stories, fantasy, what is its purpose? Does it have value? And a real argument against the idea that fantasy and fairy stories are just for children and not adults as well. And so Tolkien says, bully to that. Yeah. No, it's actually valuable to everyone. And if you can't find a way to enjoy it as an adult, that's something wrong with you, not wrong with children.
Yes, and this is essentially his defense of fantasy. And when saying that term, we're saying that in the modern day because when this article was written, fantasy wasn't used as a term to define the genre. Mm-hmm. The first time it was even used in the Oxford Dictionary was 1949, a couple years after this article came out, and it was first used in the titled magazine called the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So this stuff didn't exist yet, but Tolkien is specifically talking about fairy stories, which he will define and we'll get into. But if anybody doesn't know Tolkien, he's also a devout Catholic and a philologist. I hope I'm saying that right, but a studier of language. And that is very important because throughout the rest of this article, there's a huge insight into Tolkien's faith of what he thinks about what fairy stories should do, what fantasy should do, but how it relates to his faith and also just his philosophy on storytelling. So if anybody wants to know the mind of Tolkien, this is the article to read. You read Lord of the Rings, you see, Lord of the Rings is his example of exactly what he meant through this article.
Yeah.
And it's a profound example. So I encourage everybody to go read this, or at least we're going to break down the whole thing as well. So sit back, enjoy that. And if you want to enjoy more from us, we have a Patreon in the link down below where we have a monthly book club. We chat all things books. Come hang with us. And we also have merch if you want any of our merch. I'm wearing my hat. There you go. So anything else, Rich, before we go to his first section on this story?
Now let's get right into it.
So he titles this called Defining Fairy Stories, Defining the Fairy Story, and what does Tolkien say about that? What is a fairy story? Before he gets to his argument, he has to go, what is it?
Yeah, so this is, I'll give a quote here of, Tolkien defines fairy stories as narratives about the perilous realm of fairy. It is like kind of the element there. It's a world of enchantment and wonder, not limited to stories about fairies. He was very specific. They involve magical elements, otherworldly settings, and a sense of the marvelous, distinct from mere dreams or animal fables. So, Tolkien actually does go through quite a few examples of what maybe a layman or casual observer would say, it's based in a not the real world, meaning fantasy. That's not the definition that Tolkien was particularly using. He excised from the definition quite a few examples. Aesop's Fables would be one of them, where Aesop's Fables generally are beast stories, where there are no people in the story. It's just animals that sort of act like people and then give some type of moral message. Those are beast stories, not particularly fairy stories. Then there's also stories that are related, that are focusing on fairies, like a story about a fairy. Also generally not a fairy story. So
Yeah, the strange way he defines it. This is the one thing that I was confused at first when reading this.
Yeah.
When he defines fairy story, he's looking as a philologist or philologist. Sorry, we're saying that wrong. I'm saying that wrong. He's looking at what is a definition of it, and he says, here's what people define it as. This is Tolkien saying this. Either A, it's a tale about fairies, or generally fairy legend with developed senses, or B, an unreal or incredible story, or C, a falsehood. Now, those are the three definitions people use, what he looked into. And to the first definition of a tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend, he said that's too narrow. That's if it's about, like you're saying, if it's just about fairies, no, that's not what this is.
It's not sufficient of a definition.
And then a falsehood or an unreal or incredible story is too broad. So Tolkien's looking at these definitions going, okay, one is just falsehood, which would be fiction. That's all fiction. And then one is story about fairies. Fairy stories are more than just that. And so the way he defines it, and what you're getting at with the Beast Tales, is he says what it is not. He excludes things. So instead of him being able to just define and go, this is a fairy story, he says, okay, fairy story is generally this, the perilous realm, etc. But what it's not is a beast tale. And what he also says, the most important of these, I think, is when he specifically excludes any stories which say that the story isn't real or it takes place in a dream. That's the most essential part. Yeah, go ahead.
He references Alice in Wonderland for this.
Yeah.
Alice in Wonderland being like, it's stated in the book that it is a dream. But now I think you can actually go into this of like, is it really a dream? How much of it is real? Point being, the breaking of the illusion. Tolkien's kind of looking at this of the story, like for something to be a true fantasy or true fairy story, the magic, the world has to be treated seriously. It cannot, like, you can have satire in a fairy story, but what can't be satirized is the fairy world itself. Internally, it must be taken seriously. And so that excludes dream tales. That excludes a lot of even stories that aren't necessarily dreams, but it's clearly tongue-in-cheek, and that the world is created to be mocked at. Those aren't fairy stories.
Princess Bride.
Princess Bride.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would not fall under a fairy story.
His definition, yeah.
Yeah.
And it does exclude all that. He says this specifically too. I would condemn, Tolkien says, the whole as gravely defective, like a good picture in a disfigured frame. If a writer, if a waking writer tells you that his tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep, he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of a fairy. The realization independent of the conceiving mind of imagined wonder. And he hones in on this point. He's very, very firm in this opinion of you cannot break the illusion. And you see that in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, where even as he's describing the books, they are written by the characters in the world.
Yeah.
They're written by Bilbo and Frodo, and you see in the preface, hey, this is being translated to your modern tongue. These are what hobbits are. This is what pipeweed is. He sticks to his rule there and wants. It's why a part of why we feel so immersed in Middle Earth. Of there's never a break of the illusion. It is a historical document in a way. That's how much he hones in on this. You do not break the illusion. Almost a good analogy I would use is a magician that shows you a card trick. He's saying fantasy, or specifically fairy stories, because we'll get into this later, but fantasy is a subsect, as a part of fairy stories, which he gets into later of how he defines this. But it's a magician, an act. You never reveal your secret. You want that wonder.
Well, you also get into the idea that he condemns the author that does break the illusion by themselves. Is, in many ways, I do kind of see it as, I understand the point of, if you, the author, you, the storyteller, break the illusion yourself, it's almost like the coward's way out. You know, like, basically you make a story and then you undercut yourself because you don't have the confidence in being able to make it as real as possible. Because the risk is you try and tell a story that's, internally consistent, the secondary world, and if it's just not convincing and someone then reads it and goes, it doesn't feel that real, then you failed. But if you undercut yourself already, then you didn't really fail. It's the, I kind of also see it as, you often see, honestly, us, frequently enough, where if we're trying to make a point and trying to get across our ideas, and then we undercut ourselves before we even finish by the way, we're just silly, funny guys. That's the common cop out.
The coward's way out.
The coward's way out is going, you espouse something and then go, well, actually, you don't hold my feet to the fire. I'm a comedian. I'm just a silly Billy. I shouldn't be taken seriously. That's a coward's way out.
Because then how can you, anything that you attack on my opinion, it was just for fun.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that way you get to avoid the real criticism and you get to avoid the actual scrutiny.
It's a tough thing we have to balance here because, not that we're doing the hard thing, but the tough thing to balance for us is informative, but also we like to have fun. But also, don't want to cop out, hey, this episode is going to lean more into the informative stuff and that end. So this is less our opinions, but I do want to put a lot of our opinions in here. Just ask you on that definition of fairy story. What do you think about Tolkien's definition here? Is it enough? Does it start the article off where you're understanding what he means by what a fairy story is?
By the beginning of the article, it was more confusing. And especially because he starts off the article with mostly elimination rather than prescriptive. I think by the end of the article, I understand his point a lot more of what... Because once you understand the purpose that Tolkien is getting at of what is fantasy supposed to do, what's the function, and often this is actually a more common thing of what are definitions, what are words. You know a definition, you know something by its function. If you were to try and describe defining a table, and you try and define a table by what it looks like, because there's many different types of looking tables. There's many different types of, form of the table. But ultimately, the way you define a table is through its function. What is its primary function? What is its intended function? Often it's more intended function because you can have a table that's broken, but that makes it a broken table, but it's still a table. So its intended function was a structure for you to place objects upon, primarily. That's generally a table. Now, anyway, with the definition that Tolkien gives of its functions, I think you can far better understand what is its definition.
I appreciate it. He said, I'll quote him on this, of how he explains his definition or his caveat on him not defining it perfectly. Tolkien, in his own words, says, I will not attempt to define that nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole. Yet, I hope that what I have later to say about the other questions will give some glimpses of my own imperfect vision of it. I highly appreciated that because as you're reading, you're going, okay, he's not giving you a table is this is a table. He's describing fairy stories and going, it's a very hard thing to describe. Here's what it's not. And later in the article, you'll see here's what makes an essential fairy story. So he's starting us off with that because he wanted to get deep into the roots and weeds of what did people think fairy stories were. And he was saying, hey, and he's lecturing here. He grew up in England. He's talking about what does the culture see as a fairy story? Are these fairies are diminutive elf or fairy, these small creatures? And he was saying how it's not unnatural that in England, the land where the love of delicate and fine has often reappeared in art, fancy should in the matter turn towards the dainty and diminutive, as in France it went, But essentially saying people think of fairies this way, and people have this, lack of a better word, a bias of, fairy's Tinkerbell. Fairy is this. But he's not talking about Tinkerbell. So that's why he gives a lot of the caveats to, okay, I'm not talking about little fairy flying around buzzing. This is what a fairy story is not, I
think that'll be the biggest confusion for people reading the article today or listening to us now.
Yeah.
Is I think ultimately what Tolkien is trying to do is define the word fantasy without that really settling into at the time, because people used the word fairy story in the way that people would today use the word fantasy.
And he want to go on to our next section here, because I guess the biggest takeaway, because that section, there's 6 major sections. That's the first one. The biggest takeaway I had from that is fairy stories must be presented as true. That's the biggest thing I gathered from that section of they must be, do not break the illusion. That that's, I would say, biggest takeaway. Did you have another big one, or would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's later cemented in the essay, but not only must it be true, but your job is to create the secondary world and keep people there. When we talk about world building and immersion, that's the primary goal. If you break that, then almost everything else falls apart.
We'll definitely quote him exactly on that. He says, he describes that secondary world and what you should be doing in fantasy very, very well, obviously. So the next section is the origins. This is exploring the origins of fairy stories. So the first was defining it. Now this is, where did they come from?
Yeah.
So there's
Austin.
Yes.
Where did fairy stories come from?
Well, let me tell you. So Tolkien says there's obviously a lot of elements here, and Tolkien talks about there being many copycats of old stories. And he talks about patterns first as the origins go. He talks about there's copycats. There's many things you can go prior to Tolkien's time and look at. Even when we're talking in the modern lingo of, oh, look at all these ripoffs of Lord of the Rings. Look at all these ripoffs of Dune.
Beauty and the Beast. Yeah, there's so many different. Red Riding Hood has both the German version and then the English and French version. You can guess which one is the more grim and sad version. Oh, Germans.
And so Tolkien, in his time, we don't like to think of this. We're in such these modern sensibilities, thinking we are dealing with problems for the first time. And Christopher Rocchio has a great quote. It's not spoiling anything from the books, but I believe it's in Demon in White, where he talks about, we use the term postmodern as if we are the present and future and not something of the past, and as if we are the current, and if we aren't just a glimpse in history. He says it a lot better than I do, but we say these words, modern art, postmodern. This is just for our time. This is going to be ancient one day. And just to reiterate that, Tolkien is talking about the origins of fairy stories, saying in his time, people say things were cliche, unoriginal, going back to stories that have been told since the dawn of time. And he pushes back on that. And he says, I quote, "It is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that sorry, let me say that once more from the start because I butchered that. It is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count." And Tolkien, what he's saying there first, and why I thought it was important, we can say this all the time when we're reviewing a book. Oh, I've seen this before, da-da-da. Tolkien's seen a lot before. And he's saying that these patterns that you see, it's not just about the patterns, but you have to look at what is the meat of the story. So that's the first thing, because the origins he's looking back to, he's getting at the point where, we had that kind of joke of an episode pod where we talked about the 10 types of stories. It wasn't a joke. It was, we were talking about, here's the 10 types of stories from the book Save the Cat, where the book Save the Cat breaks down to 10 different genres of stories that get told time and time again. And then at the end of that episode, we concluded every story is just one story, right? You can all define it down. You can get reductive with everything. And Tolkien addresses that and then goes, I just thought it was important to start there. Tolkien talks about that. And sorry, I'll let you go from there. But I thought that was important to mention first.
Yeah. Do you see what is his point on the value of originality, or the fact that there are so many copies, or as he would say, a sub-creation? What do you think his note of that is? Is it more valuable, less valuable?
I think what he gets onto after that, why he says that's important, is he's defending fantasy as not just a reading experience, but a thing to analyze. Mm-hmm. So he's getting into the point of, it is not a waste of time to look at these things that you might think, oh, you've seen this before, you've seen this before. There's always something to garner with good fantasy, with good fairy tales, essentially. So he's starting off with the point of, it's not as simple, and you can't just gloss over it. There's more to it than that. These origins have something that's true to it. And in the modern sense, or C.S. Lewis's article said this, where if what fantasy can do, what fairy tales can do, is you look at something from a perspective of, instead of looking at it from the perspective of you or I, what about the perspective of a satellite, of a turtle, maybe Tolkien wouldn't say turtle because he doesn't like beast tales with fairy stories, but you get the point of, that matters in fantasy.
Well, I think this really does hit on, if we want to bring it to modern times and modern conversations.
Yeah.
Though I guess it isn't really that modern. It's still old, but it's something happens all the time now, is adaptations.
Oh, yeah.
And, or not even adaptations, but just redone, like, a live action remake or remake versions. All of these things where the best type of adaptation in my mind
It's Rings of Power.
Don't you dare put those filthy words in my mouth.
I didn't say it. Just I was saying it for you.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't
You're
saying
gonna
that for
try.
me.
Yeah. But no, the best part is seeing a story from a different perspective. That's a valuable addition in an iteration. Or if you're going to remake something, remaking it from maybe a different cultural time. They change the time, change the place. My favorite one to bring up, an example I've brought up now several times on this podcast, is The Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven. Is the same story. Plot beat for plot beat. It's the same story with roughly the same characters, like character types, with slight differences. The difference is, hey, one is in Japan with samurai. The other is in America, the American Wild West, with cowboys. And they're mostly the same, but there's subtle differences because of the perspective and time change. That is a wonderful remake. That's actually valuable. It gets you take a similar story and put it in different contexts, and you see it with a new spin. And especially you reach different audiences with that. There's plenty of examples like that where
Great point.
you look at something like, I don't know, the Lion King remake, which ultimately, what did it do? What perspective change did we get?
3D.
3D. That's not much of a story perspective change. Like, what added to the conversation? How did it capture the soul again? Did it do it in a new light? No. So you might as well just watch the old one.
The better one.
The better one.
So Tolkien, when he's defining the origins of fairy tales, he gets into this. Similar to defining what fairy stories are, he defines the origins by not giving a direct spot definition. He says this: I shall therefore pass lightly over the question of origins. I am too unlearned to deal with it in any other way, but it is the least important of the three questions for my purpose, and a few remarks will suffice. It is plain enough that fairy stories, in wider or in the narrower sense, are very ancient indeed. Related things appear in very early records, and they are found universally wherever there is language. We are therefore obviously confronted with a variant of the problem that the archaeologist encounters, or the comparative philologist, with a debate between independent evolution, or rather invention, of the similar, inheritance from common ancestry, and diffusion at various times from one or more centers. And he goes on to say the history of fairy stories is probably more complex than even the physical story of the human race. That's how complex
I do love
this
the
gets.
little jab there. Like, evolution, like human evolution is less complex than the evolution of stories. To which, to some degree, I kind of agree. Like,
totally.
Like, the process behind evolution is generally not complicated. Like, elementary school kids can understand the concept of, generation. Like, evolution is just whoever survives breeds and survives that whatever situation, and then that compounded over time leads to species change into other species or variations of species. That's basically it. Mm-hmm. Now with that, you have some fun questions of like, hey, look at these two species that are nearly identical but don't seem to have the same common ancestor. They evolved independently. Why is that the case? And like, that interesting questions, but that actually gets to stories, how there are plenty of tales that ultimately mostly evolved independently. I think there's some great common examples of, and you get to ask the question why, of plenty of stories, including the Bible, talk about like a great flood And there's plenty of different stories about that across the world in different cultures.
Epic of Gilgamesh has
Epic
a
of
great
Gilgamesh,
flood, I believe. Yeah.
And you go like, okay, is this from something? Is there a common ancestor? Is there historical truth to it? Is it a common trope? But I think one of the fun ones is also dragons. How across cultures, seemingly very far related, have their own versions of dragons.
Right. Well, because we were visited by alien dragons.
Yes, exactly.
Of course.
And they,
they flew around the world and they started going in stories.
Yeah.
You disagree?
No, of course.
Oh, okay, just checking. But that point of...
We live in a world that used to have dragons and now we have less. It's fine.
And you're getting exactly the three things he breaks down there as far as where did these fairy stories originate is one, was it independent evolution, an inventor of, okay, did human over here think story, human over here think dragons, human over here think dragons. Two, diffusion, and this diffusion only, Tolkien says, only refers to the problem of origin elsewhere. So if it's diffused, by definition, okay, where did the inventor live? So even if it was diffused, that means it has to have a founding source, so the diffusion doesn't get anywhere closer to the answer. And then three is inheritance, which is also similar to diffusion in, well, inherited from where? So the question comes down to, what Tolkien says is, well, if we believe that sometimes there occurred the independent striking out of similar ideas and themes or devices, we simply multiply the ancestral inventor, but do not in that way the more clearly understand his gift. And Tolkien essentially is saying here, he's getting to the point of he can't just go spot and go, this is where story came from. He's not saying that it all originated in this one tiny town called Richville. And not that they were rich people, it's Richardville, and then stories emanated. If that were the case, all stories you would love. But you don't love all stories.
But not all stories came from Richardville. And so
there's some bad stories.
There's some bad stories out there.
What are some of those?
I would say Fourth Wing.
Oh, would you? But it has dragons.
I would. It does have dragons. Not the right
Tolkien
dragons.
Tolkien define Fourth Wing as a fairy story? Most definitely.
Unfortunately, yes.
Do you think he would?
Yeah. It fits the definition. Like, in both function and, like, practice.
I don't think he would. I think
he may not like it.
No, I think he would. In his point about the catastrophe later and the end. Well, who knows how the series ends? But it's
still fantasy.
You tell us. Would Tolkien define Fourth Wing as fantasy or as a fairy tale? So,
something I do want to get at that this gives us a hint of what Tolkien. It gives us a hint of the religious aspect that Tolkien puts onto fairy stories and fantasy, is the idea of a subcreation and getting into that mankind has this inheritance to basically adopt and emulate their creator, and that God, the creator, creates the world, and therefore man desires and fantasizes about creating their own world. And there's this inherent link between that of I'll put the quote here, fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And so just from his Catholic perspective of, because man was created by the great creator, that we as mankind desire to create other things in our likeness and create our own sub-world, our secondary world, which put that way, I find very interesting, that desire of creation.
Yeah, that point to what he makes about fantasy is that origin itself and that subcreation. He says in such we may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. And the preface of that is he's saying that, sorry, I should give more context.
Yes.
He gives an example of green grass. And he's talking about grass and going, the human mind can look at that grass and say it is both green and grass and separate the two in our heads. There's two qualities to that grass. The green grass isn't just one thing. There are two separate ideas there to combine. And so what Tolkien says when it comes into the fairy story is, we may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. In such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made, fairy begins, man becomes sub-creator. So he's essentially saying that this fantasy, this imagination then comes from us taking things we observe and then, okay, instead of green there, well, green doesn't go on a face. That is now horrifying, right? That's where you start to create this more imaginative process. So he's going back into the weeds of how did man create these layers and origin of fairy stories, and just intuitively came from that observation.
It's also a reference to the idea of originality, of like how different from the primary world, as Tolkien references, or the real world, does your fantasy story have to be? Does it have to be completely unrelated, where there's no connection to the primary world at all? I think Tolkien really getting at, no, that our creation comes from our own observations. It's about, but it's not about like just taking and putting there. It's about adapting and creating something new. And so there can be allusions, there can be references to the real world, but you don't want to let that break the second world. So
yeah, it totally gets that. And he gives, this is what I think, this is where the article gets very, very interesting to me, because his faith starts to seep in, and he starts to set up part of his...
I would say not seep, it's placed.
Oh, yeah, placed. but this is where he Chekhov guns the ending of his article very well. So in his discussion, we're still going on the subject of the origin of fairy stories, the origin of it. So he gave that definition, which couldn't get exact, but when he gets into the origin, he talks specifically about mythologies, Olympus, for example, and he explains the origins of Thor and illustrates this as an example of an origin of fairy stories. I'm going to quote him directly so I don't screw this up, because this is very important for the ending of the article. But take this in, and Rich, you've read this, but this is what Tolkien says about the origin. He says, "Let us take what looks like a clear case of Olympian nature myth, the Norse god Thor. His name is Thunder, of which Thor is the Norse form, and it is not difficult to interpret his hammer, Mjolnir, as lightning. Yet Thor has, as far as our late records go, a very marked character, or personality, which cannot be found in thunder or lightning. Even though some details can, as it were, be related to these natural phenomena, for instance, his red beard, his loud voice and violent temper, his blundering and smashing strength, nonetheless, it is asking a question without much meaning. If we inquire, which came first, nature allegories about personalized thunder in the mountains, splitting rocks and trees, or stories about an irascible, not very clever, red-beard farmer of a strength beyond common measure, a person in all but mere stature, very like the northern farmers by whom Thor was chiefly beloved." And I'll take a break before going back into that, but he's asking essentially, okay, if Thor has this personality, did it come from a culture of northern that are looking at thunder and then ascribing a personality to that god? And he goes on to say, to picture of such a man, Thor may be held to have dwindled, or from it the god may be held to have been enlarged. But I doubt whether either view is right, not by itself, not if you insist that one of these things must precede the other. It is more reasonable to suppose that the farmer popped up in the very moment when thunder got a voice and face, that there was a distant growl of thunder in the hills every time a storyteller heard a farmer in rage. Now, this is a fairy story, and Tolkien says this: if we go backwards in time, the fairy story might be found to change in details or to give way to other tales, but there would always be a fairy tale as long as there was any Thor. When the fairy tale ceased, there would just be thunder, which no human ear had yet heard. Okay, so breaking down that, it's important to bring up that part, because when he's talking about this Thor myth, and he goes on to give an awesome example. I've never thought about it like this before until he put it this way, but he talks about this tale of the Archbishop of Canterbury and a banana peel. And he says that nobody would discredit the fact that if the Archbishop of Canterbury slipped on a banana peel, and if that story was told, everyone would go, oh, he must have slipped on a banana peel. Okay, got it. Now, he says, for example, if, let's say, that one person might start to disbelieve that story if the person discovered that an angel or even a fairy warned the archbishop that he would slip on a banana peel in 2 days, and he slipped on a banana peel. The change there goes, okay, you believed it, slipped on a banana peel, it's all real, but then as soon as you put angel or fairy, all of a sudden, wait a second, you start to disbelieve that a bit. And he brings that to the best case you possibly can. Best example you can use is King Arthur, because King Arthur is definitely mythologized and definitely legends created, and what was actually true versus who was actually King Arthur. Was King Arthur even important? Who knows? But that example,
some would say yes, kind of important, but still.
But
yes.
what did King Arthur do? What did he actually
United
do?
England? Yeah. Someone in the comments help us out. Actually,
yeah,
people on our Patreon will help me out more.
Yes. But we're reading, what book are we doing this month that is very Arthurian?
The Winter King.
That's our book club of the month.
Yeah.
Yes. I heard it's very Arthurian. But that example he uses, he says history often resembles myth because they're both ultimately of the same stuff. So essentially he's saying there's real history and there is myth, but he posits the question of why the truth of the myth, the truth of the angel talking to the Archbishop of Canterbury, that being the disbelieving part. He talks about these stories that are passed down and says, why isn't that theme, why isn't that point made there just as true as the banana peel? Is essentially what I'm dumbing down a lot, but he's saying, why is the myth looked down differently than the historical? Well, who even knows if the banana peel was real? Why don't we question the banana peel just as much as the angel? Because that banana peel is just as likely to be made up than the angel is in that point. Yeah. Because I could just say, oh yeah, Rich slipped on a banana peel yesterday, which didn't happen. But if I said, oh yeah, Rich talked to an angel yesterday, it didn't happen. Well, I don't know, maybe it did. Mm-hmm. But those two things, if I was to say those stories, both could be untrue. Both could be true. Who knows? So that, I thought that was just a fascinating way of how he looked at this, which then goes into his later messaging about his faith, and which I can't wait to get to that part. But that long ramble just to get at, he's talking about myths and things that are technically can be nonfiction, and the onlooker will have that knee-jerk reaction as soon as it is something you don't believe can be possible. That is what you don't take as true.
And also just completely discount all value for, which is basically what Tolkien is fighting against here, saying there is actually great value in fairy stories, in myth, legends, just like there is great value in history, just like there is great value in math, art, all these different science. All these things have great value. So does mythology. So does fairy stories.
Mm-hmm. And so Thor being this figure, and tropes like love at first sight existing, which Tolkien does refer to. He says love at first sight, that would not exist in stories if that wasn't true, if that didn't exist in a certain realm. Because if no person ever fell in love at first sight, how could that be a thing in stories? Or if the concept of that was never believable.
He brings up the whole Romeo and Juliet idea of if there was no one in history that ever has fallen in love at first sight with someone with a party that is adverse to them. If that has never happened, then Romeo and Juliet really wouldn't ever exist. And so that begs a question of all these different mythologies of, you look at it and why does this exist? It's not wholly untrue. Why is it there? There is a nugget of wisdom or truth beyond the veil of fairies and ogres and things like that.
Yes. Exactly that. Did you have some? What did you think about that point on mythology and Thor and even the Archbishop tale there? I had never thought of it that way until he described it that way. And when my superficial knowledge of this article, that was not a portion I knew about. I guess I knew about the later portions about fantasy and the eucatastrophe. Didn't hear that, so that was at least new for me when reading this. Was that new for you, or that wasn't as...
relatively new to me as well. I mean, that's something that you kind of have in the back of your head of the idea that fantasy maybe has, of course, a higher probability of not being real, but you don't look at the same way as different tales of history. History also has just as likelihood of, not being real. It maybe has a higher likelihood of being real, but these are, just because one is taken seriously doesn't make it actually true, I think is the important point of there's kind of an idea in this is more media literacy, and I know it's different aside, but I promise there's a point that when doing studies against like people being able to read falsehoods at news and like being able to spot fraudulent headline articles, basically it's something that should obviously be true, but isn't, I guess, as obvious. People are able to spot falsehoods in headlines around things that they, intimately know. So a scientist that has a high degree of specialization in solar energy is able to read articles about brand new solar cells that use carbon fiber as batteries, or looking at it going, bullshit. It's just like, this is not, or at the very least is able to see like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, and that there's a high degree of falsehood mixed in here. That it is not, like, they don't take it as complete truth and are skeptical of it.
Tolkien,
However,
Tudor Ramble said Fourth Wing is the best fantasy book.
Yes. Hopefully someone watches our stuff and understands maybe that's not true. But no, here's the interesting point. Everyone kind of obviously knows this. If you know more about a subject, obviously you're going to be able to pick apart what's true and what's false a lot easier. The more interesting part is that degree and mental skepticism is not applied evenly, not even close.
Oh, yeah.
Of you'll read an article that is really clearly false, but because it's not in your wheelhouse, you're willing to accept it as true. And I think that's what Tolkien's kind of getting at with history, of people will read a historical story, and because they don't particularly know, like, in any great details, the actual true history or any kind of scholar within it, will just read it, go like, yes, true. And because it's seen as more trustworthy, versus because they've lived in this world rather than the thing they do have experience of, the primary world, our world. They see a fairy story, a secondary world, and instinctively know more about like, that is untrue. But they don't apply the same level of scrutiny to historical stories that they do with fairy stories. And that probably should.
Right. There's a reason why zero astronauts are flat earthers, because they're all paid by Big Earth.
Exactly.
That's the reason.
They're financially motivated to push the big lie.
I've always wondered,
the big round lie.
I've always wondered, what is the incentive to push the lie there?
I'm honestly, it's one of my, that is a guilty pleasure of mine, is to look on the Flat Earth Reddit forums of trying to, I think I was in like a Discord or, what is the old
TeamSpeak.
TeamSpeak.
That was back in my Minecraft days. I would use TeamSpeak all the time. Yep.
Trying to chat with someone of going like, I chatted with a flat earther like once, and just trying to get across to him like,
that's fascinating.
Are you on the coast at some point? Like, you can prove the earth is round, or at least curved, like on your own. Of like, go out to a beach on one of the coasts and then like lay down as the sun's going down if you're on the west coast and up on the east, blah blah. Anyway, lay down, and then as the sun is going down, as soon as it passes the horizon, stand up. And then all of a sudden you see the sun again. Why? Because at a lower altitude you actually are, like, if the earth was flat you wouldn't see a change, but if you stand up you can actually see the curve. Anyway, point being, like, it's one of the things you can actually prove to yourself, and it's fun.
Well, Big Earth pumps the other side, the curvature down and up when people look to.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, how would somebody combat that one? I got nothing.
I can see it. I have done the experiment myself. I don't have to go to space to do that.
You also do what they did in ancient Greece, or it was in Egypt, where I forget which philosopher or scientist, mathematician did this, where they stuck a pole at the same time and just tested the degree of the shadow in one location in Egypt than the other, and you go, oh, shadow's bigger. There's plenty of ways you could do it. But the point being that skepticism that you have of a story that comes out there, and Tolkien, I wonder if Tolkien had a lot of flat earthers in his day. What would he say? But his conclusion to this, what are the origins of fantasy stories? I'll conclude with his words. He says, fairy stories are by no means rocky mattresses of which the fossils cannot be prized except by an expert geologist. The ancient elements can be knocked out or forgotten and dropped out or replaced by other ingredients with the greatest ease, as any comparison of a story with closely related variants will show. The things that are there must often have been retained or inserted because of the oral narrators, instinctively or consciously felt their literary significance. Even where a prohibition in a fairy story is guessed to be derived from some taboo once practiced long ago, it has probably been preserved in the later stages of the tale's history because of the great mythical significance of prohibition. A sense that significance may indeed have lain behind some of the taboos themselves. Thou shalt not, or else thou shalt depart beggared into endless regret. The gentlest nursery tales know it. Even Peter Rabbit was forbidden a garden, lost his blue coat, and took sick. The locked door stands as an internal temptation. Well said. And he gets that biggest takeaway I have from this section then is these underlying truth and stories, however mythological or historically accurate, namely that there's a reason that the story changed throughout time, or there's a reason for the significance that narrator, whether they did it consciously, unconsciously, whatever they did to that story, the reason it resonates true is because there was inherently something about that change or something about that mythology that made the story more quote unquote true in a sense.
Well, there's something almost scholarly of the idea of looking at a story that has survived today in all of its iterations and then tracing it all the way back to close to it, as close as you can get it to its origin, and seeing what has changed. And you can often ascribe that to the prohibitions of the time and the different ideas. But then what is the nugget of truth that has survived hundreds, if possibly thousands of years? Like how does that happen through historical stories? And that's almost it's a generational study of the truth, and like something that has survived in that particular story for that long. Definitely like every generation that it passed agreed that was important. And that's something.
It's a classic for a reason.
It's a classic for a reason. And if it's still alive today, you got to go, man, there's probably something here. There's probably something here that's like gets closer to a true idea of truth.
And if it's not there, there's a reason it's dead.
Yeah.
We don't remember the tales that have nothing to pass through time.
Yeah. We don't keep a lot of stories that have nothing to say.
Or literally, it just wasn't spread enough. So that could be the case. Anything else on that section before we move on to the third of his 6 topics?
No, but I believe this next one is probably one of the more important aspects of this lecture.
Very important.
In addition to kind of clapping back against the person that the hall was named after,
Andrew Lang.
Yep. So Andrew Lang talked a little bit about how.
What's the section titled?
Yeah, the section is the value for adults and children. What is fairy stories' purpose and value? Is it just for kids? Is it for adults? Is it for everyone?
Literally titled Children. It's children. We're talking about the value of fantasy for not just children, but adults. Yeah.
So Andrew Lang does propose that like fairy tales are for children and should be framed and discussed as such. And so Tolkien says, nay, good sir, nay.
In his words, he says, the association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history.
I like it. He does point out the idea of often what we give children is the afterthought items that are left in the attic. And that the only reason that maybe children's stories are seen as only for children is because we give them the inferior product we don't want to use ourselves. And that is more a negative trait of the adults than particularly what a child particularly likes. And that children will generally try to like whatever you put in front of them. Not that they do like things, but they will try. They'll try and like it. And so you don't necessarily need to alter fairy stories and tailor it and dumb it down for children. That's not particularly beneficial. It's not a medium that is only for them, and that you're ultimately doing children a disservice by taking fantasy and trying to dumb it down, chip it away to make it more digestible.
And Tolkien would say to anybody out there, I don't think he would define The Hobbit as a children's story at all. He would very much say it is a story for children and adults.
Yeah.
It is a fairy tale. It's just for everybody to read. And he clearly, The Hobbit can appeal to children, definitely.
Yeah.
But it is not handheld to children at all. You see that through his work. Mm-hmm. The Hobbit isn't necessarily talking to you like you're 5.
Yeah. But I mean, he brings it up in there, and he brings it up in his essay, but it's also brought up plenty of times often that children's stories and material for children should very often be something beyond their reach. Children benefit from being able to consume or do something that is just a little bit beyond what they're currently capable of. And that's within physical activities or reading. It's all these things. That's why children actually benefit from hanging out or playing with kids of an older age, because they're going to emulate and try to do something maybe a little bit out of their comfort zone, a little bit out of their age range. So your fantasy stories, written correctly, appeal to children, but also adults. And because children are humans, just like adults are humans. They're on the same path as all of us. If they can get something out of it that the authors clearly put in there, that it is somewhat digestible for them, but there's elements in that story that maybe is a little beyond them, but they're reaching for and they're trying to. And it allows that same story to be read at different points in that same person's life. And they get to grow along with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the generally true of, like, don't try and write fantasy stories that are only for children.
And exactly to your point, Tolkien says people treat children as if they're a different species.
Yeah.
And he hones in on that point as exactly as you're saying. And the quote, one of the most famous quotes from this article, explains what children are capable of and also what fantasy, even in the modern sense, means in the world building and the immersion. This is the quote. If you're to take away one thing, I believe this is what the article's one of the most known for quotes. Okay, so here it is. Children are capable, of course, of literary belief when the story maker's art is good enough to produce it. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at that little abortive secondary world from the outside. If you are obliged, by kindliness or circumstance, to stay, then disbelief must be suspended or stifled. Otherwise, listening and looking would become intolerable. But this suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing, a subterfuge we use when condescending to games or make-believe, or when trying, more or less willingly, to find what virtue we can in the work of an art that has for us failed. And he uses a great example after that of the game of cricket, of a bunch of adults go watch cricket. Tolkien was a man of his time, and today we'd say football, soccer, football for
in England,
Europeans.
still some of you cricket.
Yeah. And he describes a sport where adults go and watch, and they are taken to a secondary world. Adults circle around and believe, oh yes, these are the rules of this game with the ball.
Yeah.
The ball goes.
Hey, blue team. The blue team is I am one with the blue team.
This is literally my whole life. And I enjoy sports. It's a great analogy.
You want to ask yourself, is that even close to true? Just watch people hang out together and watch sports. Yeah, they are immersed in their secondary world.
It's adult fantasy.
It's adult fantasy. Yeah,
literally called fantasy football. You create your own team. That's a different thing. But that point rings true. I think that quote can describe fantasy today, not just fairy stories, but that's a one-to-one of, I would say, modern authors look back to this and look at this quote and go, yes, that is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think this does get to a little bit of why Tolkien does not particularly like allegory and doesn't like a story that is so clearly on the nose a direct call to the primary world, because it breaks the illusion. Reason why he didn't particularly like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is how directly related to the primary world it was breaks the illusion. It breaks the secondary world. And ultimately you have to suspend your disbelief, which is a cheap knockoff of actual immersion, which, interesting, of course, it should be kind of obvious for me, at least, of Tolkien, the one bringing this up, of I have never been more immersed in any world than the Lord of the Rings. Like it is the strangest feeling I've ever had of after I've watched the movie at the point when I was reading the books, like, 5-10 times. I know these stories inside and out, and then I read the books, and no spoiler warning. It's Lord of the Rings. When Frodo is presumed dead by Sam, and Sam believes he has to go on with the ring and carry it himself, and at the moment I had a genuine moment of like, oh no, Sam, what about Frodo? And I was concerned whether Frodo was alive or not. And I've watched the movies 5-10 times. Like, in the primary world, I should know. Looking outside in, I would know that, of course, Frodo lives, because I've experienced this before. I know what happens. But because I was so immersed in the secondary world, every second it was believable. And I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the mind of someone in our primary world. I only had the mind of someone that was with Sam. I was only there in that moment, because Tolkien is a master of his world building and his immersion. I've not had that experience since, really. It's
awesome.
Honestly not been close. Close would be Project Hail Mary.
Coming off that read, yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, I don't know if Tolkien wouldn't say that's fantasy. He would not say it's a fairy tale.
It's not a fairy tale.
Which we'll get into. That kind of odd thing where the story itself gets so into culture that you know all the things that happen, and then you go to read the book, and for you that happened with Lord of the Rings. Happened with me A Song of Ice and Fire, and reading the book going, oh, what happens next? Because you get so immersed in that secondary world, which on the one hand could be, oh, why are you doing this? You should be smart enough to think, but you want to immerse and you want to feel what the author's intending you to feel. You want to fall for that magic trick. And that's essentially what it is, this magic trick, this cricket game, this story. And he continues to defend the point that it's fantasy is for adults just as it is for children. And what did you think about the points he made on how children are more they are more susceptible to believe in stories, and yes, after a story is told to them, a child will say, "Oh, is that true? Is that true? Is that true?" What did you think about his points there?
Well, I mean, it made sense of because children have less experience in our world, and they obviously are trying to define the boundaries of the primary and secondary worlds where, you know, adults have more experience, but also plenty of adults fall for untrue stories all the time. And so it's not exclusive to children, but they definitely have more lessons to learn, more experiences to gather to be able to delineate the difference of, you know, a child who has never seen the snow. You know, you tell them that, you know, white little stars fall from the sky and blanket the entire landscape in fields of white. I'll be honest, if you've never seen snow before, you go like, nah, that can't be true.
No
Is that
way.
true? Then you see it, and all of a sudden, it becomes not a fairy story anymore. It is true.
Think about SD cards. And think
They are
about
magic.
think about any type of technology, you watching us through this magic screen on this magic device where our voice gets projected as if it's fairy magic to your ears through time and space. Humanity has mastered technology and electricity and metals. If we told you 100 years ago, I believe this was, I just want to give credit, Cosmic Skeptic, what's his name?
Alex O'Connor?
Alex O'Connor, yeah. He's very thoughtful guy too, very, very convincing. He's an extremely smart, if people want to check him out. That shows you one thing too.
He's also really kind. He's a polite fella.
He's awesome. Yeah. I love watching, I don't know what I am. I love the ultra religious Tolkien and the cosmic skeptic atheist. I just love listening to the extremes. So this, he gives this example of, look at this metal whatever that was created and on the microscopic level you can't even comprehend, and now we have all of this. If you were to tell somebody that 200 years ago, you'd look at them dumbfounded and go, yeah, okay bud, I'm sure that'll be a thing. But it's actually magic. And Tolkien, to your exact point, says, of course, the borders between them, and as them referring to children believing, oh, is it true that Komodo dragons are real? Is that true? Versus a real dragon, which an adult human would know the difference. But Tolkien says, of course, the borders between them are often fluctuating or confused, but that is not only true for children. We all know the differences in kind, but we are not always sure how to place anything that we hear. A child might well believe a report that there are ogres in the next county. Many grown-ups persons find it easy to believe of another country, and as for another planet, very few adults seem to be able to imagine it as peopled, if at all, by anything but monsters of iniquity. So adults, just where's your stretch? Where's your border of belief? You have more life experience and you start to think you're smarter and you could be more skeptical about things or more profound in your convictions of what's true or not. And you might surprise yourself. So it's also true for adults, but to a different degree.
Yeah, just because you gain experience doesn't mean the elimination of the borders of your imagination and boundaries of reality. It is just that boundary has changed. Mm-hmm. It has expanded, but doesn't mean it's not there.
Yes.
Which is important to realize.
Yes, and this section, he really does get into Andrew Lang. He goes into the man's own lecture hall and beats him with facts and logic.
Lays him the literary smackdown.
You know what I appreciate by Tolkien specifically is he has time and time again let his opinion be very clear tactfully. He said, yeah, Dune, not for me, champ. That's a quote. And he said
those
earlier,
exact words.
He said earlier in this article that there was this, I don't even know the book, but somebody who wrote Michael Drayton wrote the thing Nymphidia, and Tolkien said he hated it. He said it's it's known as one of the worst ever written, dull story. And those are quotes. He said that in this article. And I'm saying that because likewise, he's talking about Andrew Lang respectfully, saying why he disagrees with him. And Tolkien goes on to say this view, this view of stories being for children, and uses this quote from Chesterton that immediately wants is making me want to read Chesterton books because it's
G.K.
just such
Chesterton is just
wordsmith.
he's the man of quotes. Like, you want like a good quote to live by? G.K. Chesterton's he's got a quote for every type of situation.
So Tolkien pulled
He's
one
great.
out of the bucket.
Oh yeah,
He pulled one,
Completely.
and this is one of the best quotes I've ever heard. Okay, to encapsulate this theme as well, Chesterton says when talking about the themes of what did children look at versus how do they differ from adults. And I hope I'm setting this up right because the quote really hit me. I want to make sure I don't get this wrong. But Tolkien was talking about interest about, hey, Tolkien was curious about dragons, not treasure hunting. So different stories appealed to him. And Tolkien said that he didn't get, quote, a real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened by a full life at war. So for him, when he was a child, fairy stories didn't strike him then. It didn't happen till he was an adult, where was wakened
near
by
adult,
near adult by after going. Because Tolkien was in the Battle of Somme, was a soldier in World War I. So fairy stories hit him later in life, and so Chesterton has this quote saying, "For children are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy." Which is just
that is one of the hardest quotes I have ever read in a long time.
Think about it.
Oh God, how much does that hit you personally? Of going like,
for children are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. Now, I didn't set that up perfectly because the context of that is Tolkien's talking about how children and adults differ. But he says when children look at a story, and he's describing how, hey, when you look at the bad guy and the child has this different kind of border than the adult has of how they view what is true, what is not true, they look and they seek justice, and they're going, get the bad guy. Well, adults, as Chesterton's saying here, why do we prefer mercy sometimes? Why are we more merciful than that innate childlike instinct can sometimes be? Because we are also capable.
Well, not
the wicked.
Not just capable, but often the more drenched in wickedness one may be, the more they may desire mercy. And which, God, what an interesting thing to chew on. Of now you have to think back of the stories that you read, and why do we love stories about redemption? Maybe it's because we have also done terrible things that we wish for mercy and redemption on it.
Yeah.
Is your desire or is your desire for, your gray hero and your anti-heroes and things like this, or is it more of a reflection of your own wickedness, your own past, your own decisions, that's what you desire, versus a child wanting justice? Oh,
so profound. It's so true.
Well, it gets off to an interesting question of there people maybe would like to. This is something I was reading from G.K. Chesterton, is the idea that it is commonly held that mercy is a virtue. It is, obviously plenty of other religions, but Christianity being like chief among them, being known of like one of the chief virtues is mercy. Jesus Christ is, the figure of mercy,
forgiveness,
God's mercy upon sinful man. But there is the virtue of mercy, but the often overlooked idea is the virtue of justice, and that justice is a virtue and often at odds with mercy, and that there can be times of mercy in excess is a vice, that the criminal, the evildoer will want mercy, and that is not a virtue of them wanting mercy, or us wanting mercy for others is because of our own wickedness. So there is this balance between justice and mercy, and not wholly one is better than the other. Anyway, fascinating.
It's so incredible. We got to read some of his books.
Oh yeah, I got one G.K. Chesterton book on my shelf, but I swear I had others.
We can snoop around.
Yeah, I thought I organized my shelves better. but not well.
To summarize this section, the conclusion by Tolkien, in quotes, is, if fairy story as a kind is worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults. That is his section here on what makes a good fairy story.
Basically, I think a succinct way of thinking about it is, if the fairy story is only appealing to children, that is not particularly a worthy fairy story, where it's not a high degree of quality. Of like, a really good fairy story should appeal to both children and adults. And that if you're reading a child a fairy story, it should be one that can also appeal to adults, so they have something to reach for and something to strain their own mental faculties for.
And then he goes to...
Basically, don't let your kids watch Cocomelon. Let them watch Paw Patrol.
Oh, so you're
Ever
going...
so slightly better.
Not Cocomelon, but Coco.
True.
Coco is a top-tier film. That is incredible.
Or Puss in Boots 2.
What are your favorite animated films for children?
Puss in Boots 2, The Last Wish.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect film. It's a perfect film.
Yeah.
Okay, animated films to show your children out there: Puss in Boots 2, The Last Wish, Coco, Your Name,
Yeah.
Emperor's New Groove,
Very true. Yeah.
WALL-E.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the best animated films ever made. You have them all now. That's your 5.
Yeah.
Those are the 5 best
animated films for children.
Yes, for children.
Yes.
Oh, because I guess there's more animated adult stuff.
I would say up there on my favorite animated films total would be a sound.
Yeah, that one's not for
Sound
children.
of Your Voice. That's not for children.
That's not for children. At all.
Yeah, no. A Silent Voice is top 3 of my favorite animated works. Period. I love that story, but not for children.
We got to rewatch that. I got to watch that again because I remember liking it, but I think I was going in with my different headspace. You got to show me it again.
It's the point of like there are stories that should not be for children, but for adults. But there is not the other way around, of where a story that is only for children and not for adults. That is as Tolkien puts it, the rarer or non-existent case, that if done properly, it should appeal to both.
Yes, and he has 2 more sections: the fantasy section and the recovery, escape, and consolation section. So he has said these 4 things are described next. The first one being fantasy, and this is a part of fairy stories. Today in our monitor lingo, fantasy is a genre in and of itself. What he's saying here, because fantasy wasn't a genre at the time, he says, in quotes, fantasy in this sense is, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved the most potent. He is describing how fantasy as a topic, as a thing to do, is often looked down upon by others because it's imagination. The whole point of this article, he's going, oh, it's Tinkerbell, oh, it's Cinderella, that's what a fairy story is. But he's making it very clear here that fantasy has the harder task of not already starting with a basis of you have to suck somebody into your world. And in the words, what he says is fantasy has the advantage of arresting strangeness, as he puts it. That's a term that's been coined and used a lot since he had it in this article, but fantasy arrests strangeness. And that advantage there is, okay, you can have something that wows the reader, that shocks you and goes, oh, that's odd. That's different, because fantasy can do that. Fantasy allows you to arrest that strangeness. But then that's where the advantage is turned against it, Tolkien says. He says many people dislike being arrested. Many people, they dislike meddling with their primary world or getting these glimpses of this unknown. And so even though you can arrest strangers, some people might be off-put by that and going, we know many people who are like, your dad doesn't like that so much.
Not as much, no.
No, he likes some sci-fi and stuff, but if it's too weird, he might not like it. There's lots of people like that. People don't like fantasy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this is where Tolkien defends and says why fantasy is a higher form of art. He's not just saying it's on par. He said it is the highest form of art. He says it's difficult to suspend disbelief. He says, in quotes, fantasy has also an essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more sub-creative, but at any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce, the more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. And he also goes on to say that it's difficult with drama because fantasy, it's hardly ever exceeds in drama. And when it's presented invisibly and audibly, he's talking about plays in this sense, that's very hard. Like men dressed up as animals, how do you take that seriously? And so already you're starting at a point of how do you get somebody to take your story seriously and get them to suck in? That's why fantasy, to Tolkien, to me as well, is even more impressive than any other genre.
Yeah, he also does reference the idea of the divine, that it is the divine right of man to create this sub creative world, that, you know, the divine spark of creation, and that's just like a creator creates the planet, the earth, the humans, the birds, the bees, all these things. So does man desire to create a world of their own. And in so doing, you have a closer perspective on maybe the idea of divinity. Like, which to me, it does kind of make sense. You get to you dip your toe into the water of the idea of creating a world entirely of your own, and how would you design it? And then you, as the creator, get to see the troubles of your characters and going, well, how do I give them freedom, but they still need to complete the story? And what do I do? There is some degree of understanding, I guess. Not completely, and of course it's like I'm being hyperbolic in that, but I think it is true of trying to understand the idea of divinity by a creation of your own world.
Yeah, you are touching the divine in that sense of going, you are the sub-creator here, and therefore you can have this, for lack of a better term, godlike power.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he that's where you mentioned that quote about fantasy being a human right. That's where he says this, that fantasy remains a human right. And he says, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. Mm-hmm. That's where this starts to seep in more of you're seeing his background of where is he standing, where is his philosophy at, and this is where we now get into the next section here of recovery, escape, and consolation. And those three different things are another thing that these fairy tales do that are exemplary to him. This is what makes a fairy tale. So that fantasy portion, sucking you into a world, and now this next part. Something that we referenced in the beginning of this video, the idea of a definition by its primary or intended function. Mm-hmm. These are the 4 functions of a fairy story, according to Tolkien. And so if it fits or is attempting to do these functions, that is whether or not it is a fairy story or not. So the first one being fantasy, the act of creating an imaginative world, and part of that is taking it seriously. A world that is, you create the secondary world, and then ultimately it's just a dream. You have already shattered the fantasy of it. It is no longer fantasy, it is just a dream. So I think that step 1, primary function 1, is creating a secondary world that is internally consistent and real, that makes people want to believe. And importantly, he defends our job here. Tolkien, he as he's talking about this first subsect of fantasy and then going in recovery, he talks about analyzing fairy stories. And he asks the question, is analyzing these fairy stories, is it a waste of time? Oh, Tolkien, thanks for quoting this quote here, because what he says is the analytic study of fairy stories is as bad a preparation for the enjoying or the writing of them as would be the historical study of the drama of all lands and times for the enjoyment or writing of stage plays. The study may indeed become depressing. It is easy for the student to feel that with all his labor, he is collecting only a few leaves. Now, continuing from that, he says, we do not or need not despair of drawing because all lines must be either curved or straight, nor of painting because there are only 3 primary colors. We may indeed be older now insofar as we are heirs in the enjoyment or in practice of many generations of ancestors in the arts. In this inheritance of wealth, there may be a danger of boredom or the anxiety to be original, and that may be read to a distaste for fine drawing, delicate pattern, and pretty colors, or else the mere manipulation of over-elaboration of old material, clever and heartless. But the true road of escape from such wariness is not to be found in the willfully awkward, clumsy, or misshapen, not in making all things dark or unremittingly violent, nor in the mixing of colors and through subtlety to drabness and the fantastical complication of shapes to the point of silliness and on towards delirium. And he's making this point of when it comes to fantasy, he's talking about this next stage of recovery coming in, that pattern recognition, that, hey, is it a waste of time to do this? And aren't all stories just so similar? And he's using the example of, well, there's 3 colors. Well, there's lines are either straight or curved. You can create so many different things with your defined rules, with your, quote, limits in a way. And that, I think that's very important because, one, Tolkien defends us here. So, but besides just that, I do think it's the point of why we got into this in the first place. One of the many reasons is we do take the genre very seriously, obviously. So if anybody's into this hour-and-a-half video, you are somewhat invested in this genre. So we are unfairly preaching to the choir because whoever would be reading this at this point or digesting this information wouldn't have much of a retort because why would you waste your time? Listen to this for an hour and a half. I'd be curious more so if somebody's watching at this point, but to see somebody reading the point of this article and hear out who does think it's a waste of time. Where are they coming from in that sense? Which I can also understand. I can see how somebody can look at fantasy and disregard it as just.
Well, the easiest one is opportunity cost. There's plenty of there's a lot of things to do in your life. If reading fantasy and reading fairy stories is taking up so much time that it comes at the opportunity of other aspects of living your life, then it is a detriment. But it is only detriment in the idea of the opportunities lost that time could have been spent better on.
Right.
That's it. I mean, fantasy in and of itself is, I agree with Tolkien, surprise, surprise, it is valuable. It's just how much time do you put into it, and there are other things to do in your life.
Yeah, we joke on here often. We kind of push and pull you all just to keep you on your toes of saying, hey, on the one hand, stop reading, go live your life, turn off the YouTubes, turn off the podcast, and go do things, which we do mean. We also are more honing in on that because what you're on right now is social media and you're watching entertainment stuff. We like to think we're providing some information and value. We hope you enjoy that. We do also. I don't want to take the joke route of, don't take us seriously, because we do that plenty of times, but we do think we provide value. But on that point of, we say that because we ourselves are victims and we are the adults, not the children. We are the ones who are capable of wickedness and do just scroll and do waste time. And we know we are victims of that, of our own doing. And so also want people to turn off and go do more productive things. Now, on the same side of that, I think we are in a more accepted subgenre, accepted hobby, where I use this example in the past, but you know how chess is an acceptable hobby versus going and playing Fortnite is a not acceptable hobby to people of, I'm going to play Fortnite. Oh, that's a waste of time. Which I don't play Fortnite, so I'm not being like positive or negative. I actually don't. I played Fortnite once, actually, just a story to go back. Okay. Freshman year of college. My experience with Fortnite was actually detrimental. It was devastating.
Oh, really?
I almost cried. I almost cried.
Explain to me.
I've never told you this story, but I was the biggest Call of Duty gamer. I'll get back to the point, I promise. I was the biggest Call of Duty gamer in middle school or so, up to when I was 13, 14 years old. I was pretty good because I was a teenage boy who had all the time in the world to just play video games.
Yeah.
And I was really good. I was pretty good at Call of Duty. And I stopped doing console games and went back to PC and eventually went off to college. And I had to stop gaming because it was a problem. I said, going high school into college, I'm not touching PC games, console games. It's too much. I'll just scroll on TikTok instead. It wasn't a thing back then, I don't think. But anyways, I'll just waste my time doing other things. And so I think it was my sophomore year of college where I went back home and my friends were playing Fortnite and they invited me. I was like, you know what? I had my old Xbox and I decided to throw it on and play with them. I was so bad at the console game and I was sitting there as a 20-year-old playing the game. It was a moment of weird, sad maturity to me of going, I'm not good at the video game. and kids were beating me. And I went, oh, I'm the old guy. No, I was 20, but I'm the old guy who's getting his ass kicked by 13, 14-year-olds. I was thinking back to when I was that 13, 14-year-old destroying all these people. And then I was thinking, oh, I was just killing guys in their 20s who are out there just trying to have a fun time with their buddies. And
loser, how are you so bad at this game? It's like, I'm sorry, I have a 9-to-5 job. I don't have 8 hours. I don't have 12 hours a day to play this damn game. I have an hour of rest at the end of the day.
That's it. And you ever see that clip of they have these compilations. I see these videos of where you kill somebody in Call of Duty and you hear the mic on the other side. Oh, you got me, buddy. I'm gonna have to go tuck my kids in now. Good game, buddy. And you just see all the sad music, like, oh, I just killed a dad. You get all sad. Anyways, it was a moment of clarity for me. Going back to the point of what was the point? Wasting time. And yes. So reading is seen as a higher form of hobby, and I don't think we could, in our conscious, do a podcast or something about something that we didn't think was valuable. It's the point of
we would get we've tried to do videos that we just kind of half-assed, but like thought maybe this will be interesting to people, and we weren't interested in it, and it's like 15 minutes in, just like
we delete it.
We're
not posting it.
Nah.
we have to come up with something. Not that we haven't done things that are YouTube-y, like, oh, tier list and that, but we have done things like that, but it's just more so the point of
I guess our tolerance for our tolerance to let ourselves talk about uninteresting things is very low.
Yeah.
We're not willing to do that.
Yes. And so point is, hey, go do things that are valuable for your time. And the personal belief that stories are
valuable, but
incredibly valuable.
It is important to do things like realizing that the human experience has a lot of things to offer. Experiencing stories is certainly one of them and is a valuable part of the human experience. Mm-hmm. But so is the joy of actually creating something of your own, to discovering your purpose and drive in life, finding love, making friends, all of these great things in life. If reading or consuming stories or playing video games and these things that in moderation have value, if that is getting in the way of you accomplishing everything else, then it is a vice. Then it is something to turn off and pause.
And I would say my personal tolerance for stories is far more extreme. I'm Tolkien train of if real life didn't exist, just consume stories all the time. It's so valuable. But obviously Tolkien would also agree there's a level of moderation of don't close off from the real world.
There's also the little bit of the Marcus Aurelius kind of thing of philosophy and in this case stories are meant to be used. The lessons you learn from stories are only so valuable as you get to go into the world and practice the lesson that you have learned.
And Tolkien's argument is all these fantasy stories, all these fairy tales, there's endless knowledge. It's not just the same thing. Even though you can draw a straight line, a curved line, there's 3 primary colors. There's an endless source of knowledge. You will never reach the end, which is what I so deeply agree with there. You're never going to hit the end. There's always going to be stuff. Fantasy will always be there. And that's what's special about that. Love it. Thanks, Tolkien, for this defense of fantasy and fairy tales. So the next part he gets to is recovery. Do you want to take that off of what does he mean by recovery as an essential component of fairy tales?
What he has for recovery is the idea that fairy stories help readers see the world anew, restoring a sense of wonder and clarity to familiar things like love or nature. Now, this is kind of getting at the idea of the weakness to magic is familiarity. And that too often that you run through the world and on your commute to work and you see the same field trees, you see the same dune of sand, you see the same gigantic towers of glass and human majesty.
Happens to us. We live right near DC. How many times we walk by the Washington Monument and all the cool stuff that we would be tourists in another if we didn't live here.
That familiarity destroys magic. And I mean, that's common even inside stories themselves, as you see often if you're creating a secondary world with magic is real, often the people inside can't see the magic as magic. It wouldn't make sense because it is something familiar, and that's why it's taken seriously, versus us is the sense of wonder. So recovery helps readers see this. You get to experience a world through fresh eyes and through something akin to wonder. And it wipes the slate clean of familiarity and once you're done, you can exit the world and hopefully take that same perspective, those same eyes for wonder, and apply that to the primary real world. So next time you go through a walk, you pause and you actually take a look at the trees. You actually maybe and bringing up kind of an example for me is once I've thought about the land of Middle Earth and the Ents and where did the Entwives go, and imagining that and seeing the forest as a place of wonder. Next time I go through trees and I look at it and I imagine like which one of these trees would be an Ent, and I look at how grand they are and the fact that Ents are generations old makes me see the trees as like, wow, these trees have been here longer than my grandparents have been alive. These trees have been here since before this city was named. Things like that allow you to see the world anew. And that is the recovery magic that fantasy has to offer.
Would it be incorrect to say that this recovery could be titled as perspective as well?
Sure.
This recovery, this new perspective that fairy tales give you, unlike anything else.
I think the new perspective is great. What Tolkien is getting at of recovery is bringing that perspective back home.
Yeah.
And not just having a perspective on the secondary world. If you don't take that lesson, you don't take that vision back, then it's not particularly recovery.
And the important thing here too is that this is where maybe we should have brought this. I mean, it's natural to bring it up now because this is his next point: is escape. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the Stoics of Marcus Aurelius versus Tolkien and how he views stories. And even though we're talking about moderation and we're talking about, hey, also live your life, there's a balance. Tolkien makes another great point about what escapism actually is, and his defense of why escapism is so good. And how he puts it is that the critics, what they conflate is, in quotes, Tolkien says, they conflate the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Now, what he's saying here is the flight of how critics view escapism is, oh, you're fleeing, you're deserting, you're leaving you're in the midst of battle and you're leaving. You're using this as a crux. You are escaping the real world as a, go ahead.
The abdication of responsibility is the key claim of the deserter.
And where Tolkien's saying it's the escape of the prisoner. And this is where you really start to see, again, it's more insight into Tolkien's writing of how Lord of the Rings is written and how he views nature versus industrial work, and not just work, but industrialization and machinery and the ugliness of, what really, this movie sucks. Sorry, I'm going to offend people. The Brutalist. It was nominated for Oscar. Awful movie, awful architecture, horrible drivel. It should be deleted. Movie burning. Bring it back. Get that out. Okay. That's my point. Like the Brutalist architecture, and some buildings look ugly. Ugly. Look at Brutalist architecture and tell me that insipid, disgusting, weird, I can't even describe it because it looks alien yet modern and human and weird and gross.
There's actually a communist reason behind a lot of quote unquote brutalist and modern architecture.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. No, the idea of a beautiful and unique architecture will necessarily kind of draw someone to have identity or place value in the location that they are, where the communist would rather you put it is all for the state. The state is primary value. And that if you have ugly buildings in uniform, that you will not have a direct love or tie to any particular building in existence. And then you will actually be more more loyal to the state rather than your location or your building.
I mean, could you extend that to something like uniforms? I mean, how extreme can you get? Of like, obviously,
that actually is a point.
Yeah, things like uniforms or things that make you all feel a part of the group rather than a part of your more individual. The more you can express individuality, more. So,
but that is a purpose of uniforms, is to take away some individuality and give some identity to the collective. Where I think uniforms are great in like certain circumstances, of course. But like
my point is this architecture, get rid of it.
But that's the thing. My values, I want to connect to where I live. I love beautiful architecture with history and roots that is unique to the location. And it allows me to connect to a certain place in a certain time.
Places have a story.
Yes.
And of themselves.
That is where I don't want uniforms. However, for a time and place between a 9 to 5, I think wearing a suit is a good idea. A uniform of like, that's the time for collective action. Where military, of course, should have uniform. There's collection. But there's a time and place for collective identity and individual identity. It's not wholly
blanket,
separate.
yeah.
It's not like, because no man is an island. We are communities, but we also have our little bit of flair.
Exactly. And that's why I love the way he puts it, the escape of the prisoner versus the flight of the deserter, and where you see in Lord of the Rings, the Ents and the wildlife and then how nature focused it is, and then where the orcs and the industrialization, why that feels so menacing, and the ugliness of orcs and the beauty of the elves and Lothlorien and woodlands and everything. And so he says here, in quote, about the escape of the prisoner, just so a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery, in the same way these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only on the desertion, but onto real escape and what are often its companions, disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the Quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking, you only have to say the land you loved is doomed, to excuse any treachery, indeed, to glorify it. Oh my God, what a way with words. Just, it's such a powerful way to say that escape of the prisoner line, where I'm like, yes, I'll be a patriot. I won't.
Yeah. Well, it's the idea of the people that complain about escapism kind of discount the idea of like, why does the person want to escape? And that escaping to some ideal is not like, you want to escape, but hopefully bring that back. Like, it is, to escape means there maybe is something wrong. And we live, of course, imperfect lives. I think everybody has a time in their life when they want to escape. I think his point here being like the difference between prisoner and the deserter is, if you use fantasy and escapism to completely abandon responsibilities to make your life better, and it goes too far, like there is a difference between escape and complete desertion. And like, I know I've experienced that. Like, there's times in your life where it is hard, where you do need that escape. But if you take that to an extreme and you completely abandon all your responsibilities to improve your life, then you are the deserter of your own existence.
Well, I don't think that's exactly what he's. That's an additional thing you're saying. But I think what he's getting at here is he's not even giving the flight of the deserter credit in that sense.
No, he is charging that other people see escape as desertion.
Yes,
and that.
But he's not even saying that. He's not even mentioning the extreme of, if you do too much, you could be the flight of the deserter. It's a warning. No, he is directly saying that. I guess from a religious sense too, if you think about it, he's looking at us on this earth. We're here temporarily. What he gets to by the end of this is the great escape at the end is death.
Yeah,
I mean, everybody will experience death and then go to the afterlife or whatever you believe is happening afterwards. And
imagine him. He mentioned previously in the essay of he only found his love for fairy stories on just as he started to become a man and exasperated in when he went to war. Of course, Tolkien would want to escape. He was at the Battle of the Somme in World War I. One of the most bloody and vicious, vile battles in human history. That is grim stories to tell a man that experienced the Battle of the Somme that no, you are a deserter for wanting to escape, at least for a time during this horrific I can see why he would find that just incredibly insulting. Of, you want me to live in that reality forever and not have a break from it? You don't want me to escape from this hell on earth? Yeah. What right do you have to tell that person you're not allowed to escape?
And to even tack onto that point more, what he's went to war, and that increased his love of fairy stories and appreciation. And now he's looking at how society is changing over time. And this is just the 1930s and 40s, what he's talking about. Imagine what he'd think today, where he says the notion that motor cars are more, in quotes, alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor obsolete thing and substantial dream of an escapist. For my part, I cannot convince myself that the roof of Bletchley Station is more real than the clouds, and as an artifact, I find it less inspiring than the legendary dome of heaven. He hits on this point of how, again, comparing motorcar to the forest and a chimney to the clouds. These more, not just abstract, but fantastical things are more real to him even than this confounded reality of what he's in. And it concludes in this great escape, eventually death, and all stories. This is where it comes to the most important aspect of a fairy story, where we talked about the origin and the definition. We went through why it's for adults and not just children, and how this fantasy go into the secondary world, this recovery and this escape, and ultimately a conclusion of which he says every fairy story ought to have a happy ending. He says almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. He says almost, but he goes on after that to say, no, like this needs to happen. And what he actually coins a new term called a eucatastrophe. And that eucatastrophe, I'll let you have the quote up, Rich, of what a eucatastrophe is.
Basically, it's the joyous, sudden turn, the hallmark of fairy stories, offering hope and a glimpse of ultimate victory over despair.
Yeah. It's not a catastrophe. It's
akin to the Christian resurrection. That would be the eucatastrophe. And so, I mean, it's the difference between our reality, which often doesn't have an answer and doesn't have an ending. It's just a continuing, things don't end, they just stop.
He says, it is the mark of a good fairy story of the higher and more complete kind that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and have a peculiar quality. It's this joy to have at the end. It's after the whole journey and the tumultuous struggle that you went through, the temptation, Lord of the Rings, the temptation, the ring, all the pain you have to go through in that journey, and in the end, have the book closed with a joyous, heartwarming finale. All fairy stories ought to have that, he says.
Which I makes me think about if you compare Lord of the Rings versus, A Song of Ice and Fire, and the story that it has.
First Law.
And there is something of, I would push back on First Law having, I like the ending of First Law, but I think there's something about George R. Martin not being able to finish his story. And I think part of it is the idea of there does seem to be something very difficult in taking something fantastical and not having that it not having that what the eucatastrophe ending, because you try and think of that tends to be the most satisfying of an ending, like, or an ending where just everything sucks and it's all bad, and then like, and we're done. It's generally never satisfying. It's just normally doesn't work. You can comment down below the exceptions to the rule, but I'm wondering if maybe that's part of what George is having a problem with, of going, he set up all these things as the antithesis of a Lord of the Rings. Honestly, you compare this exact same thing with Dune. People's common complaints of, like, people love the start of Dune, but then ultimately don't really like where it ends because it doesn't have a eucatastrophe. It is generally pretty grim. It doesn't have a nice twist ending.
So there's some, I know stories that you love that do end like that, though.
For example?
But it's a Western. It's a very popular Western. If you don't want spoilers, it's a popular movie. And
Sure.
also a book by Cormac McCarthy. Here's your chance to skip 10 seconds, but No Country for Old Men, for
Sure.
example. It's just...
Yeah. Again, I think that's more of the exception to the rule.
It's more...
And also
genre,
fantasy.
Yeah, it's genre and it's tone. It's what you're setting up. And obviously what A Song of Ice and Fire did and what First Law continued to do and built up off of this grimdark wave is it was a challenge to Tolkien. Not a challenge and they disliked Tolkien, but a way of showing the genre was so defined by Tolkien for so many decades that this was a change of pace. And it was something that shocked people, but also created an interesting subgenre that was good in its own right. And again, this different from what Tolkien's describing as what he calls a fairy tale in the modern sensibility and tone of, yes, we would describe Lord of the Rings and we would describe A Song of Ice and Fire as both fantasy in our definition of fantasy.
But
now,
Tolkien would not put them into the same bucket.
And he wouldn't call it a fairy tale. Now, if Tolkien was alive today and he understood the definition between, okay, fantasy is a genre and also fairy tale, he might even say, yes, they're both fantasy, because his definition of fantasy, if you just look at this article, is transport into secondary world. That's the fantastical. To him, that is fantasy, which
it's a rough, close enough definition that would apply today.
And today we would call that high fantasy, essentially, because high fantasy is a term of our world, primary world doesn't even exist. You just start on a different planet, different world, whatever. Low fantasy is more so your Harry Potter, your Percy Jackson. We start with Alice in Wonderland of start in our world, then go to secondary world. And
the secondary world is within our own world.
Yes. Yeah. And so that description of how he wants fairy stories and think they need to end with a happy ending, a eucatastrophe. Your point on Song of Ice and Fire, you think that is part of the struggle of why George R. R. Martin isn't finishing, possibly?
Maybe.
Okay. I mean, he's trying to make sure, how is it satisfying?
Yeah.
Because, this next book isn't even the finale. There's supposed to be 2 more.
Uh-oh.
So, which they're coming, of course. Of course they're coming.
Yeah. Sure.
Anything else on that? Do you want to move to the epilogue, his conclusion, which I think is the most fascinating part of the whole thing? It just keeps getting more interesting.
Well, this last section...
You want to move on to it?
Yeah, let's move on.
This is the epilogue.
This epilogue is where he kind of does...
One more thing. Mm-hmm. Well, one more thing is, in the start of this epilogue portion, he also says the whole joy part we talked about, the eucatastrophe, he does admit that it needs more consideration. That's why he said almost. He said, I would almost go as far to say you all need happy ending. He advocates for that, but then says it does need more consideration, but he feels strongly. So I just want to say he had the strong opinion, but he said, I understand there could be exceptions.
He had far more stronger opinions about the other points than that one. It's more of a tendency where he understands that rule can be broken. That's not
he was
the firmest
he was very strong on this.
Yeah,
he was very strong on this. He just said he would like to consider it more, but still, he all must. At the same time, he was making a very bold and clear claim, but also saying, okay, I know I'm making a claim. I'll consider it, but I feel this. Okay, sorry. Mm-hmm. So epilogue portion that you were getting into.
Yeah, so the epilogue is relating fairy stories to myth and also religion. Tolkien, obviously, being a devout Catholic, and we talked about it briefly before, of the creation of fantasy and the creation of the secondary world being the divine right of man to create as his own maker has created him and the world that we live on. That is like that is a divine connection between fantasy and religion and myth. And it gets into a little bit more that the reason, so he's suggesting that the eucatastrophe we just briefly talked about, it mirrors the Christian story. And so I also mentioned that briefly, that the ultimate joy emerges from suffering. And though he does not like particularly allegory, he doesn't say that particularly, but the Christian idea of the great joy comes at the sudden turning at the end of suffering is key to a fairy story, as well as faith. Yeah,
and I'll quote him so we can both digest this and see how do you interpret this, how I interpret this, of describing Tolkien's faith. He concludes by saying this: I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt, making creatures men in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preemptively the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. Ellipses. Later on, this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men, and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. So that is his building up from before, why it was important to talk about how he looked at Thor and that mythos and his description of what is a fairy story, and him saying that the simple, silly banana peel thing about the Archbishop of Canterbury. But in this, how do you interpret this? How would you describe what Tolkien is saying about his faith, about the Christian story?
Oh, I mean, it's the elevation of talking all about this, of the secondary world and its value as a secondary world, but realizing that it doesn't have the same sway over the primary. You have to be sucked into it. And then the value of the same type of structure, story, the eucatastrophe, like all the elements that he's talked about so positively in the creation of a secondary world, but then reading from the Christian point of view, our own eucatastrophe, our own fairy story, that it elevates from the secondary to primary world. And what could be more divine? What could be more joyful than the fairy story of our own world? I mean, and then what comes about the rejection or the acceptance? The acceptance obviously bringing about great joy, and the rejection often being sadness or wrath. It's something that's, to touch on that, we were talking about Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic. A reason why I like him quite a bit is I wouldn't consider him maybe he was not a wrathful atheist, versus many atheists in like online community are very wrathful in their non-belief. And there does seem, at least I've seen it, there's a wrath in non-belief. I understand that you can have wrath of, religious people, but I've just noticed that
it might have been Chesterton.
There's very few people that are like atheists, but don't make it such a angry part part of their identity. I went through that period.
You did go through that period?
Oh, yeah, 100%. When I was first an atheist, and I was wrathful as an atheist. I would say I rejected it with anger, not particularly, what would be the correct term? Like apathy. That, and I wouldn't really consider myself an atheist anymore, but I wouldn't say I'm particularly faithful either.
So what are you?
All right, the correct term is agnostic, but reluctant agnostic at this point.
Yeah, and that you were saying something a second ago. I had a thought on. I'll try to come back to it, but yeah, Tolkien. Oh yeah, that's what you're saying. You're saying Cosmic Skeptic and Alex O'Connor and people like that are just coming more from a genuine, whether you're of faith or not, just seeking a conversation or truth, or just trying to actually have. You come in with the right intentions to the conversation, whereas if you just feel wrathful, if you just feel a certain way, your emotions block any sort of productive or helpful, fruitful, any positive term you want to use conversation. And that's what I was going to get at is I think it's a Chesterton quote again. It might not be. I think I'm misattributing it, but some ancient dweller was saying that there's a certain pride in skepticism as well, just as there is in belief, but pride in Christian story as well as sin, but also you can be prideful, and that's where that wrath can come from. Of you think you're so right, you think you've been so duped, and then show that in anger and show that since the other person's wrong and you're right about your worldview of being an atheist, it makes you feel so certain and can be condescending, and you want it, that comes through as that pride, that ego speaking. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this. This is another tangent down the philosophy rabbit hole, but obviously there's a bunch of forms of skepticism. I was kind of looking into this, and there's this very niche form of skepticism called Pyrrhonism. Have you heard of that?
No,
there's this zetetic Pyrrhonism, and it was very interesting because I guess it had such few followers. It's not a thing, right? And I read it and I think that could describe some. I don't like to describe that this is who I am. Because I like to take, things from Stoics. Let me just take all the good things I like from everything. A little bit of Stoic there, a little bit of Christian there, a little bit of agnostic there. Just take all the good things you want. But this philosophy of Pyrrhonism is when a claim is made, and here's where it gets ridiculous, but when a claim is made about something of, okay, the sky is blue or there's dragons, the Pyrrhonist does not judge whether does not make claim of it's true or false. So it's the hyper agnostic of, they don't look at that truth claim you made of dragons exist. And the role of the Pyrrhonist is to look at that claim and not judge it in the positive or negative, not to reaffirm or deny, but just accept that it was said and accept that, okay, that is the point of Pyrrhonism is to not make a judgment claim, to not judge upon the truth value of things. So it gets to the extreme of
that's the opposite of me.
No, but it gets to, but you see what I mean of that. It's the one way to take from it is to not be prideful or think you know what you're talking. So in the good view of that Pyrrhonist view would be when when a truth claim is made. Let's say you're an atheist, but then someone says they're God, and then you look at that and judge the religious person, or opposite, you're a religious person, look at the atheist and judge because that truth claim they're making is so wrong that you look at it. The Pyrrhonist would just go, okay.
Yeah.
But then on that you talk to the Pyrrhonist and go, hey, look at the clouds. I go, hey, look at the grass. Hey, look at if you're to take it to its extreme, it's can you value anything? Can you make a claim about anything? Now I'm obviously being hyperbolic with it, but that is another form of skepticism to where some skeptics look at it and say, hey, some form of skepticism is be skeptical about everything and look at, it's good to be skeptical about religion or not religion, whatever it is, just find the truth to it. And that can come in forms of pride. That can come in forms of not pride. But then the Pyrrhonists will look at that and go, we since we're so fickle in this, we cannot have the power to judge those in and of ourselves. So it was just an interesting rabbit hole of philosophy. I thought it was interesting.
That sounds like a very pointless philosophy, I'll be honest.
Well, I think the takeaway I got from it was it's the term atheist versus agnostic, or how to take in the how to be skeptical
without being
judging.
A douche.
Yeah, exactly. So it's to take that from it. But again, that's why you don't ascribe to just this is what I am, man. The one thing I am not, I'll do what Tolkien said and exclude of what you're not. I could say what I'm not. What I'm not is that brutalist movie with all the shit architecture and that what is it? It's literally called brutalist architecture. It sucks.
Yeah, it's
I'm
terrible.
not that. I'm not that. I'm not many things. I'm not a good. We're all not good men. We all aspire to be. Christopher Rocchio, you gotta. The fact
we are
that
all adults capable of great wickedness, therefore desiring of mercy and not justice.
and we all, the fact that we're all asking that question, as Christopher Rocchio and Hadrian Marlowe would say, the fact we're asking that question is in and of itself means that we both have that wickedness, but also shows that we're not completely corrupt and lost. If you're the insane person, you're not asking yourself and checking, wait, is this right?
If you're completely wicked, you don't ask yourself,
are you wicked?
Are you wicked?
No. So Tolkien with this is saying essentially the Gospels, he calls them a fairy story, but he also calls them the true and the primary art. And what I garnered from what he is saying here is, this is how I take it. So I don't know if he's exactly saying this, but this is my interpretation, and maybe it's close. He is saying, how I'm interpreting what he's saying is, even if the biblical story changed, even if there was mistranslation or there's different versions of the Bible, or this happened thousands of years ago, the story, the thematic elements, the mythos of it, and the historicity of it is true. Even if it changed, he is saying throughout this essay how true fantasy is and how true the fairy story is, and that even if the banana peel, or even if Thor wasn't actually, you would say, not real, but he asked the question, why is the banana peel more real than the dragon or the unicorn, whatever example he says, in the same essence of this, even with a change, even with an alteration, if it still says the ultimate human story, and because of that, it's the truest art. It is our human story, and he also, and I imagine, also believes in the historicity of it, but he's saying the history and fairy tale, the legend and history have fused for him, and so I think what he is saying, that maybe he believes in both full-heartedly, but is more so getting at, it's more than just the what actually happened, like who's right, John, Mark, Luke, or because there's contradictions there too. That one biblical gospel will say this, another will say Jesus did this, but regardless of even those alterations, the story, the legend is the human story, and that is as true because of his love for story and fairy tales. I think that's what he's getting at, is how I'm taking it.
I would disagree with you slightly on it.
Okay.
Of one of the values he talks about with a fairy story is that it takes itself seriously, and within that secondary world, it is true, it is real. And you apply that same standard to the primary world of the Christian story is true and real. It takes itself seriously because it is our world. So it's applying that same internal consistency to our world. So I think
you misunderstand me.
No, because my point is, he's not looking at it of, even if the fairy tale part of it is not true, the historicity is, and that is ultimately human story. I think he is looking at it far more literally. It is like, no, it is not only valid because of its historicity and like all the value of the story is valuable because this is the the fantastical is true.
I get you.
So I do think he's taking it more the Catholic route of, it is literally true.
Yeah, maybe I miscommunicated, because what I'm saying it from my point of view. So I was interpreting Tolkien, but when I'm saying maybe he viewed, so the example of the banana peel, of why is the banana peel more real than the dragon showing up? What Tolkien is essentially saying is that dragon is as real as the banana peel. Right? Like why question the banana peel? Why question the Thor mythology? So I think we're agreeing, saying the same thing, where he believes it's true because the fairy tale is true to him in that way, of regardless of the historicity and the legend, the mythos behind it, they're both equally true in that sense. That the fact that the gospel and the account of Jesus, or of any figure, take King Arthur used, but take Alexander the Great, a person was there, and however much of the historicity we know about a figure. So he's saying that the history is also blended with the truth of the human story. And he believes, And I guess I'm inputting that too, because, I was saying, if the gospel is contradictory, or even if the accounts didn't happen word for word, or if things were orally changed over time, whatever it might be, that's me saying that. But Tolkien would say to that he wouldn't say he would say that is all true. You get what I mean?
Yes.
I am saying, hey, things could change. I'm saying all this, and then Tolkien is saying, well, that is the truth. That is the tale that was passed down. That is.
It's not
the
just
story.
the tale, but
yeah,
I'm taking him at his word of it. He's a Catholic. He believes he believes in the literal like when he eats the body of Christ, it becomes literally the body of Christ. And he takes the Bible as truth. And the reason why he elevates it is that unlike the secondary, which the value comes from not necessarily the fantasy aspect of it, of like, hey, what is really true about this fantasy story? Because the Banana Peel versus the dragon, like it was passed down for some nugget of truth there. The reason why he elevates the Bible and the Christian story and the Christian faith is that it goes beyond the secondary of not only is the history and the story about it true, but also the fantastical. And that's what elevates it above all the rest of not only is it true based on its story, it's true based on its fantasy.
Yeah.
That's what makes it the greatest of all. That no second world can ever compete.
I see. So you're saying it's not even a second world in the first place.
That's
it's the primary world. Yeah.
The reason why you don't believe in the dragon is ultimately it is the secondary world. That is where that doubt comes from. But the fact that it is the primary world and why he doesn't like low fantasy or fantasy that takes place in our world that ultimately isn't, and it's a cheaper imitation of what the Bible story really is, of it is our fantasy world.
Yeah.
Or it's our fairy tale. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That fairy tale piece, it was curious to me that he says because we have to look at what his definition was, because we have to look at the setup to this conclusion that he makes of he's saying that the gospel contain a fairy tale. Now, when you hear that the gospel contains a fairy tale, you're going, the gospel is a myth, it's a lie, it's a legend.
But he specifically says fairy tales are not lies in that, like, that's too simplistic of an argument.
So it's his setup to show why, combining his faith with his reasoning and his general philosophy, and just showing you this is why Tolkien is Catholic. It's showing you how he writes stories, and take that as you will from when you read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but it's an insight to a very intelligent man and of how he breaks down what is and has defined a genre of epic fantasy, and so was so epic in scale that counter books had to be made to change from the Tolkien fantasy with A Song of Ice and Fire, and who knows what will change in the future of what books come out to shift. Maybe it'll be back to fairy tales one day.
Yeah, maybe
not that fairy. Of course, Tolkien-esque stories are coming out all the time. But
no. But yeah, do you have anything further you want to talk about with this essay?
I have the biggest takeaways, I think, from this article. One, fairy stories according to Tolkien must be presented as true. They do not include dream stories, traveler's tales, or beast tales. There are patterns, there are repetitions in stories. That does not devalue them. It's just like a new song or having the same 3 chords or drawing. It does not devalue their analysis or you can do infinite things within those rules and boundaries. 3, the origins of fairy stories are often intertwined with history. There's inherent aspects that are true. Also, fairy stories are not just for children. Adults need them. Also, fantasy is about suspending disbelief, bringing reader to the secondary world. Fantasy, despite its imagination, must appeal to reason. And fantasy stories, they help look at something from a new perspective, escape like the prisoner, have eucatastrophes, and in the end, the greatest eucatastrophe of them all is the Bible.
That's a pretty good summary.
That's it. Don't say they could have just skipped to the end and then not listen to 2 hours of discussion.
That's what a podcast is. Ultimately can be summed up with ChatGPT.
Oh, that'll be the day when we get AI generated. And then
God, when we get the day of just no longer do people consume full podcasts, they consume AI summary breakdowns of full podcasts.
Tolkien would just call that a catastrophe.
That would be a catastrophe.
That would be the day. Yep. I hope you all enjoyed that breakdown on fairy stories. a lot to think about. Let us know in the comments below what you thought about the article, or if you want more episodes like this. Did you enjoy yourself, Rich?
I did.
Good.
I actually prepared notes this time.
I loved it. That was great.
Let us know down below other types of essays or this kind of content you'd like us to go over. I know plenty of people have recommended on our Patreon that we read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Language of the Night, which I would like to do as well. That could
be fun.
Hopefully we'll do that one soon.
Hell yeah. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. We'll see you next episode.
Bye, everyone.